email address has been blocked.
Good morning. Welcome to the Department of Medicine Grand Rounds. Today we have a very special guest, and I'm very excited and looking forward to his presentation. We usually take a couple of minutes before Grand Rounds to reflect upon historical events that may have shaped the way we think about medicine and healthcare delivery and public health. And today I'm not going to go too far back, and in fact I'm just going to go to the weekend. Because something important happened. It was the second inauguration of our President Barack Obama. And independent of what you think about this president, one thing that is highlighted in every inauguration since some years ago is this concept of the transfer of power in an orderly fashion based on the will of the people. The fact that we go and vote, and independent of whether you like the result or not, you accept it and you move on. I think very few people have thought about that concept as one that represents one of the foundations for public health and healthcare in this country. And I want to take you back to Bailey Ashford. Eleanor has heard this story before, but Bailey Ashford was a young man who at age 26 was a military soldier stationed in Cuba during 1898, during the Hispano-American War. And he was quickly transferred to the southern part of the island of Puerto Rico at that time to assist with the things that were going on there. And as a physician, he noticed that Puerto Ricans were dying and were greatly affected by a mysterious illness, an anemia, that had eluded many before him. And he spent many months looking at a very small military microscope to identify what was going on by looking at the blood of these patients. And exhausted, finally one day he decided to look at the stools of his patients. And there it was, a parasite, Ancylotoma duodenale. And he immediately decided that that must be the cause of anemia. So he went through the process, and think about this, a man with very few resources, very few people around him interested in scholarly affairs. He put it down in writing, and within a year or so, this was published in a peer-reviewed journal. And a few years later, he returns to Puerto Rico, now knowing a little bit of Spanish, married to a Spanish woman, able to convince the government of Puerto Rico to engage in a public health initiative to address this issue. And within 6 or 7 years, he had not only eradicated the disease from the island, but he's reportedly saved over 300,000 lives. So this man had moved from a discovery to publication, to convincing his peers that this was important, to implementation. How many of us think that we can do this in our lifetime? Now, a few years later, before his death, he published a biography, and in there, he describes that he didn't do this just because he cared. We know he cared. He did this because he felt very strongly that people needed to be healthy to be able to be productive. That was key, that for people to be productive in their society, they needed to be healthy. Now think about it. Healthcare is not very high on your list when you're worrying because your child is dying of diarrhea, or you're looking for shelter because somebody bombarded your house in Syria, or people around you are being mutilated because some faction is looking for power. It can't be high on your list, and yet it is at the top of our list, in part because we have the time to reflect on it, because of this orderly transfer of power, because of the will of the people. And with that, I'll leave you with Dr. Barb Casper, who's going to introduce our distinguished guest.
It's my absolute pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker this morning. Dr. Howard Bauchner is probably one of the few pediatricians to deliver internal medicine grand rounds at U of L. And I'm confident that his topic will be quite interesting, and I'd like to outline some of his accomplishments before I give him the opportunity to speak. He completed his bachelor's degree at the University of California at Berkeley prior to medical school at Boston University. And then he began his residency in pediatrics at Boston City Hospital, finishing his last year of training at Yale University, and was a Robert Wood Johnson Scholar. He returned to Boston Medical Center to complete a year of chief residency and joined the faculty there, where he holds the rank now of professor of pediatrics. He held a number of leadership roles at Boston Medical Center as a fellow in the American Academy of Pediatrics, as well as a fellow at the Royal College of Pediatric and Child Health in the UK. He has been a reviewer for numerous journals, primarily in the field of pediatrics, but also for the Journal of the American Medical Association, for which he has been editor-in-chief since 2011. So for the last 18 months, Dr. Bauchner has been leading the charge for JAMA, and I must say that I have noticed a vibrancy about that journal in that period of time. His CV is replete with over 100 peer-reviewed publications, as well as numerous editorials and book chapters, and he's also been a very successful mentor for many students and fellows. Dr. Bauchner has obviously been successful as a teacher, researcher, and a clinician, and has shared his expertise with the future generations through his prolific writing. We are absolutely delighted that he was able to join us for Grand Rounds today, where he will present JAMA for first year. Dr. Bauchner.
Thanks, Barb. Can people hear me? It sounds like they can. I can hear that the mic's on. I have to look this way?
No, look this way.
You were pointing, so I didn't know if I have to look this way. Okay. I'm going to try to finish the talk in about 45 minutes. It often goes a little longer, but I'm really going to make an effort to finish in 45 minutes, to leave about 15 minutes for comments. I need to get back to Chicago for some editorial meetings. It's really a privilege to be here. Thank you for the invitation. People often ask, what was it like to have been chosen? So I'll briefly tell a story. So the applicant pool was for the job for the position was about 200 people, and then they quickly whittled it down to about 50 people. And then after that, it was, and this is very appropriate because we are in Louisville, it was like March Madness. It went from around at 32 to 16 to 8 to 4 to 2. And I'm convinced I got the job because I was the last person standing after a series of about 30 interviews. So I'm going to talk briefly about JAMA and then some of the things we've tried to accomplish over the last year or so. And then I just wanted to bring to your attention some interesting and provocative issues around medical journalism, fabrication, falsification, authorship. Last week I got an email, the paper's already been published, and a senior author asked if, after the paper had been published, if you mind if they add another author to the list. Not an uncommon query to our offices. And then some final observations. Published in 1883, it's a general medical journal. Appears 48 times a year, occasional theme issues, flagship publication of the AMA, but with very careful checks and balances to ensure editorial independence. And it has the largest print circulation in the world at 310,000. Print circulation generally has really gone down in the United States. So for example, Journal of Pediatrics used to have a print circulation of about 30,000 and now has a print circulation of 5,000. The print circulation of Lancet is only about 18,000. So journals really shouldn't be measured by circulation quite as much now as they should have in the past. And I would say, I don't think I'm telling anyone here anything new, but I would say JAMA and Lancet, BMJ, New England Journal of Medicine have always been considered the flagship, most prestigious publications in the world. They're weeklies, they're general medical journals. What's interesting is NEJM is owned by the Massachusetts Medical Society, and I would not say that the Mass Medical Society influences NEJM very much. I would say it's the other way around. BMJ and BMA are linked very closely, but if you read the BMJ regularly, you'll see that Fee Godley, who's editor-in-chief, has no problem criticizing the BMA quite aggressively. Now, the BMA plays a very different role in England than the AMA plays in the United States. The BMA represents about 70% of the physicians in England, whereas that's certainly not true for the AMA. And then Lancet is published by Elsevier, and it too is a weekly, and I think under Richard Horton's leadership has really developed quite a reputation in global health. We have an impact factor of 30. All of the major journals are in the 25 to 50 range. NEJM has an impact factor of about 50. we're at 30, Lancet's 38, BMJ is 15. Any of these are really considered robust impact factors in terms of the way a journal would be measured. But I don't really think of a journal as having offerings to clinicians and investigators. That is a very, very old conceptual model. And I would say journals will not thrive if they think of themselves as appealing to clinicians or investigators. At JAMA, we do know that because of the way our pages are read, our audience is clinicians, it is investigators and scientists, but it also is policymakers as well as patients. And I will point out just one piece that we had. Within a week of the horrific events in Connecticut, Art Kellerman and Fred Rivera wrote a piece about silencing gun research. We put it online ahead of print within 24 hours of receiving it. It went up 6 days after the events. And I don't think I could have been any more proud of Fred and Art, both of whom I know, as well as JAMA, when the centerpiece of the President's executive order was to release funds to the CDC and NIH to once again do gun research. He likely, with his advisors, would have come to that conclusion regardless of the JAMA piece. But I think that characterizes the profound influence that some of the reports that we can have, the impact that they have on policy. Our theme issue that was published this week is on readmission rates. Your hospital has millions of dollars at stake. This is a series of articles on readmission rates, the 30-day readmission rates, where in a number of both original research reports and viewpoints, we argue that it's an inappropriate rule. And we already know that the Kaiser Family Foundation, the Commonwealth Foundation, and CMS is already reading the totality of the issue because they want to understand what leading experts have said about this 30-day readmission rates. For hospitals that care for patients with Medicare, billions of dollars are at stake. This really is a conceptual model that dominates who we are. We have readers, we have listeners, we have viewers, we have learners, and we have networkers. And this is a very, very different view, and I'll just highlight a couple of points. Last year, JAMA had 13 million visits. The network this year, all 10 journals, will have 54 million visits. That's the contact that we have with the medical community. If you look at the viewers, our weekly author video is seen by 30 to 35 million people in the United States each week. It's an extraordinary number. We produce an author report video that's picked up by newspapers and news stations all over the world, and last year it averaged between 30 and 35 million viewers each week. And now we've begun to enter the social network field. I believe it's something that journals have been slow to adopt to, and we've gone from 17,000 followers as of yesterday, we had 29,000 followers on Twitter. I don't understand anything about that world, but I sure like writing those tweets because I can write those tweets in a way that I probably would not write in JAMA itself, and it is quite a bit of fun. So I think the model of you have clinicians and you have investigators as your audience is archaic in the sense that this is how people now touch JAMA and the JAMA network. This is what JAMA has looked like through the years. It's incredibly famous for its art on its cover. It's been the same for almost 30 or 35 years. I just signed off on the final redesign. We've been redesigning the journal for the last year. It will be launched in the spring of this year. And I would say we will continue to embrace the humanities that has been the hallmark of JAMA for the last 20 years. Poetry, piece of my mind, and art. But the redesign absolutely emphasizes new techniques, visual techniques of communicating information. After I arrived, however, we wanted to take much more use of the graphics that we have. We have an extraordinary team. The cover on the left is from November 16, 2011. It's the cardiovascular disease issue that was timed with the American Heart Association. The one on the right was a depiction of the introduction of viewpoints when we moved commentaries from the back of the journal to the front of the journal. We know that our readers love our viewpoints. We have an extraordinary group of writers. I would tell you that the best 1,200 words I've ever read about why accomplishing healthcare reform in the United States is so difficult was a piece by Vic Fuchs in January of this year. It's really quite a remarkable story. He's been observing health policy in the United States for the last 50 years, and it is a remarkable read. And so we've tried to graphically enhance the experience for people as well as to improve the content so it's more gripping, more engaging than it has been in the past. People always ask, what's it like to try to get published in JAMA? I would say if you're a medical student or a junior faculty member, it's not probably where you want to send your first paper. Okay? I love all of you. It's a tough road. Of the 4,000 papers, we will publish 200. You are very good at math. That's a 5% acceptance rate. Okay? All of the major journals, we, New England Journal, Lancet, are somewhere between 5 and 8%. And I would tell you, of the 4,000 papers, we have very good data that well over 3,000 get published in other journals. So it's pretty unusual that people would submit a paper that is not going to be competitive, at least in another journal. And so it is a very different road. The peer review process is extensive. 40% are sent out for review. Initial decision is under 7 days for every single paper. That is, if you do submit a paper, you will know within 7 to 10 days whether or not that paper's gone out for peer review. A final decision in 50 days. All papers are externally reviewed by 2 content experts and a statistician. They are then internally reviewed by a content expert, a methodologist, and a statistician. So every paper before it would enter a discussion around potential publication will have been reviewed internally and externally by at least 5 to 6 people. We have an acceptance rate of 5%. And people always say, what is it that you want to publish? It has to be novel. It must be valid. This is a recurring theme. And it is why large randomized clinical trials are important. There's always an issue around whether or not the results of randomized clinical trials are generalizable. There's been a lot of concern that subjects, patients who participate in randomized clinical trials don't necessarily then reflect the community at large or patients at large. But we know that in general, the results of randomized clinical trials are internally valid. There's been a great deal of emphasis in the last year or two on comparative effectiveness research, CER, in part because PCORI has received an enormous amount of funds through healthcare reform, about $1 billion. It's the largest single increase for a funding agency over the last decade. But I would just remind you, despite our ability through propensity matching and instrumental variation, residual confounding remains an issue in CER. And I would also point out that comparative effectiveness research led to a 20-year history of using hormone replacement therapy in the United States. It was a single, large-scale, randomized clinical trial published in JAMA that led to the cessation of hormone replacement therapy both in the United States and around the world. So I think that really characterizes the power of randomized clinical trials. We do know that they're internally valid. And then we're very interested in policy papers. Unlike most of the other major journals, we recognize that JAMA has the ability and the capacity to influence health policy both in the United States and around the world. So novel, valid, and innovative. What have been some of the developments simply over the last year? JAMA's always been a great publication. My predecessor, Kathy DeAngelis, did a wonderful job. But I think most journals need new editors periodically. They infuse a different view, a different look, a different sense of it. And so I'm going to run quickly through these and then move on to some of the editorial issues. So illustrated covers. This is the comparative effectiveness research issue, the global health issue, the HIV/AIDS, and our most recent one, the obesity theme issue. The cover from the reissues is an Escher-like portrayal. We've already had about 10 people who would like a reproduction of the cover. So we were thinking of opening up the JAMA Network store, but we're not quite sure. But these covers they signify a theme issue, and I think they've really become very popular. I would tell you on February 6th, we will offer up to the world the first change in structured abstracts in 22 years. I believe the simplicity of the change will signify a tremendous leap forward in the way we portray data in abstracts. And there will be a graphic depiction of this change on the cover. It's the February 6th issue, and it's coming. But I suggest that you really look both at the cover as well as what we are recommending that the future of abstracts should look like. After I arrived, we really introduced the JAMA Forum. This was 10 leading people, policy people who write regularly about health policy and issues in the United States. It includes representatives of the right and of the left. So David Cutler from Harvard is our health economist, who I think would represent liberal politics. But Gail Walensky and Stuart Butler also write for us. They write blogs, they come in, they're reviewed, and they go up in an hour. I believe that this has been the single best health policy column that's been written over the last year, and it's been picked up by many, many people, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And we hope in the next year to be able to open up a comment feature at the site so people can comment on the blog posts from these health policy experts. This is just an example. Larry Gostin is our legal expert. The Supreme Court in healthcare law, constitutional ripples will affect the election and beyond. The JAMA Forum is free, and that was really important to us. We wanted to make sure that people did not need a subscription to get the JAMA Forum. We've introduced author report videos, so we always had videos for the public, but we now take that author video that's developed for the public, and with some additional funding and filming and editing, that video is now available as an author report video for physicians and other healthcare professionals. What's really nice about it is that a lot of people don't watch the video, but they listen to it as an audio. And they're usually 6 to 8 minutes, and they're an initial summary of an author's study. This is a very prominent physician from Mayo, and this is what they said about John's video. The outreach of your journal was readily apparent to me when a colleague of mine at Watson Clinic, who talked to her mother monthly from a remote village in India, and her mother asked her if she knew anything about a paper by John Cantor and JAMA, which she recently read about. And, you know, to me, that is the power of JAMA. John's paper was about how women and men present very differently with myocardial infarction. And we know that that report video was seen by 55 million people in the United States. We've introduced QR codes. I was walking around, I noticed them all over the place. My children, my two young, not young boys, they're in their 20s, laughing, ask what are these? But they're, you just scan them and you can get video or audio. We introduced them about a year ago. And so you can just grab the video or audio from our print pages using QR codes. We're trying to become more accessible for clinicians, so we've introduced a series of shorts. This was introduced a few months before I started the JAMA Clinical Challenge. On January 2nd of this year, we introduced the Clinical Synthesis Evidence Report. It takes a 100-page Cochrane and summarizes it in 2 pages. We've already been contacted by Cochrane. They love them. They're hoping we can do them weekly. We anticipate doing them monthly. But the people who've seen them really like them because, I don't know, the last time we sat down to read a 100-page Cochrane report. So you know there's a lot of important information in there, but you don't really want to spend 2 or 3 hours reading a 100-page report. So these took about 6 months to develop. So in my previous position as an editor, we developed many new article types. And when I arrived and I began to discuss with different people new article types, people said, "Oh, you'll be able to develop them in a few weeks." I would say it generally takes about 6 months to develop a new article type because you have to derive it and then validate it. So we derive it from our own conceptual concepts, ideas, models of what we think it should look like, but then we need to field test it with clinicians or researchers. That's very, very important to do because we may have a perception of what someone or something should look like, but then we need to field test it. Then after it comes back in, we need to develop 4 or 5 of them before they debut. So we already have 6 or 8 clinical syntheses ready to go. And we're introducing another new short in a few months called Clinical Lab Reports. And essentially what it's going to be is it's going to take a photograph of a lab report and then it's going to interpret what it actually means. Because if you're like me, the last time I got a genetics report, I didn't even understand if it was in English or a foreign language. Okay? It reminds me of all those ophthalmology drawings that I never understood. I thought it was a little cabal that only ophthalmologists spoke that language. But now you know, because of automated lab reports, all of those little ditsies are now recorded in the lab reports. And if you're a physician, you need to respond to them. And so this new short that we're introducing is to try to help people understand what ones they need to respond to and how. Just another clinical challenge. And then, as I said, we introduced viewpoints. Beginning in January of last year, we moved commentaries from the back of the journal to the front of the journal. We know that 90% of our readers only read abstracts and only read our opinion pieces. In addition, we've also, I've asked people who are really prominent writers in American healthcare to write viewpoints for us. So Abraham Verghese has been writing for us, John Ioannidis has been writing for us. And for me, the privilege of interacting with these people is just extraordinary. I told the story last night. I needed to visit Palo Alto, and some of our writers are there. So John Ioannidis, who's probably the most prominent epidemiology methodologist in the world, is there. Abraham Verghese, an extraordinary writer, and Victor Fuchs, who's been an observer of health policy in the United States for 50 plus years. And I was having breakfast with them, and I walked in and they asked me what I thought the future of healthcare in the United States would look like. And I said I'd only comment after I got autographs from each one of them. And for me, that is the incredible privilege of this position. I have access to just remarkable individuals who spent decades thinking about various issues in American medicine. And then we've begun to experiment with something called dueling viewpoints, where we pose a question to 2 experts and they answer it and have to answer it yes or no. This is about the use of statins in healthy men. This remains hugely controversial. And then we created a relationship with the Kaiser Family Foundation, and so this now debuts once a month. It's called Visualizing Health Policy. And they've had it on Medicare, they've had it on Medicare, Medicaid, Medicare, and it's always around health policy. HIV/AIDS was the first one. And we're hoping in the future to make these interactive. But we need to do some things around digitalization of data before we can do that. And then just philosophically, what we did was create the JAMA network. And in January of this year, January 1st of this year, all 9 of the archives journals were renamed. This is quite risky. I recognize that. In some regards, when we had thought about it, it's modeled a bit after Lancet and the Baby Lancets and the Nature and the Nature journals. Now, what's very different from what Lancet and Nature did versus what we did was that Lancet introduced new journals, as did Nature. We're taking 9 very well-known journals and renaming them. And I think of the 9 archives editors, 7 are enthralled with this idea, but particularly in dermatology, archives of dermatology, and in ophthalmology, those are very, very well-known journals. And so we are taking a bit of a risk in the renaming. But the concept is to build a communication network of information for clinicians and scientists and policymakers. And because of new approaches in the digital world, we can more integrate across the journals. So this concept of a journal as a print or even the web is really very archaic. Journals really neither are print nor web. They live in the digital world, the so-called cloud. And the renaming of the journals and some of the other things we're doing from a technological standpoint will allow broad integration across all 10 journals. After the killings in Connecticut, we put up 3 viewpoints on the website of the 3 journals where the viewpoints came from. So one came from JAMA Internal Medicine, one came from JAMA Pediatrics, and one came from JAMA. But all 3 went up simultaneously on all 3 websites, giving people additional information if they were interested in about reading the different perspectives from 3 different journals. And this is what they looked like. This is old covers, but they debuted in January. For people who know a lot about impact factor, we went to ISI Thompson to ask what they thought the impact would be on the impact factor, which is very important for the journals. And they said to us, since no one had ever renamed 9 journals simultaneously, they had no idea what the influence would be on the impact factor. I'm very pleased. This is the first time I've had a chance to talk about this. Our app will debut on either March 1st or April 1st. It will be a simple reader. We are going to make it free to the world for 6 months. It will hold 18 months of content. You will be able to download it on any device that you have. So we held up introducing it until the network brand was well established, and we're using HTML5 technology. The HTML5 technology guarantees that whether your device is 3 inches, 5 inches, 7 inches, or 10 inches, whether it's a computer, a laptop, a Samsung, or an iPad, it will automatically adapt to your device and play. And so that will be made free to the world on either March 1st or April 1st. And then we introduced our new website last May. There's been some struggles with it, but it uses a very fundamentally different approach to searching. It's searched by semantic tagging rather than by matching terms. Semantic tagging implies that you're searching by concepts. It's not quite artificial intelligence, but people have thought that semantic tagging search is the next great leap forward in the way you will find content. Now I'm going to spend about 15 or 20 minutes on some of these issues. The embargo, queries from Congress, ethical issues, data integrity, peer review, conflict of interest. You can see the list. Original research is posted online first. It's difficult sometimes to coordinate editors. Should editorialists be allowed to talk with the press about an upcoming editorial before the publication of the paper? On June 29th of 2011, I get on my car to drive from Boston to Chicago. On June 30th, Annette Flanagan, who's the executive editor, calls me and asks, and I've only met her once in my life, do you have a problem? And I go, Annette, I don't start till tomorrow. She goes, yes, but Kathy isn't in the office today, so it's your problem. So we had a paper going up in Archives of Psychiatry about the impact of SSRIs used during pregnancy and on the risk of autism. So anytime autism is in the title, we know the paper will be seen by the media. And the timing of the editorial hadn't been prepared, so it was not yet ready to go online with the article. And so a number of people have contacted the editorialists to talk about what they had written in the paper. And the question to me was whether or not we should release the editorialists from the embargo and allow them to talk to the press. And that was the question that I was entertaining as I was driving outside of Buffalo. And you know, the media are very quick to respond. I have about an hour to make a final decision before they're going to recontact the editorialist. And he wanted to know, would we pull the paper if he spoke about it before it was published? So should we release the titles of papers at the beginning of a meeting 2 days before we host a scientific session? This is another question that we got. And I decided in that very short period of time that we requested that the editorialist not speak to the press about a paper that was not yet going to be published in JAMA Psychiatry. However, shortly after we made that decision, we put in a checks and balances so that editorials and original research papers would go up simultaneously so that that wouldn't happen again. An investigator is giving a presentation at a national meeting, a poster. He then calls us, and the society has appropriately organized an online chat about the paper via Facebook and voice thread. Does this violate the embargo? Should the author participate in this long discussion about his paper that's under review at JAMA, not been published? Should he participate in a long discussion? These are our rules about the embargo. Authors who present information contained in a manuscript that is under consideration by JAMA during scientific or clinical meetings should not distribute complete reports or full data presented as tables and figures to conference attendees or journalists. So when you present and a paper is under review at JAMA or any of the other leading medical journals, we do not want you to release the full contents of the paper that's under review. In some regards, it then minimizes or reduces the impact of the paper when it's published in our journal, either online or in print. So we actually recommended to this author that they not participate in the Facebook or voice thread because it would be much more difficult to control the discourse about the exchanges about whether or not this individual author could give more information. He or she would be put in the position of always having to say, I can't really answer that question because the paper is under review. Now what's interesting, there's increasing controversy about the embargo. So eLife, which is going to be a new publication that just debuted, it's from Howard Hughes, Welcome, and Max Planck in Germany. They actually are encouraging their authors to break the so-called embargo. They want them to go public with all of the information before it's published in eLife. And the editor of eLife has been very provocative about this issue. Now, it does make it a little easier that at the moment eLife is totally supported by these three institutions. So this editor actually does not need to raise any funds for his own position. So it will be interesting to see how this changes as those three institutions withdraw funding over the next 3 to 5 years. A congressional member seeks our opinion about the quality of reports regarding medical devices. What is our obligation to JAMA, our elected officials, and more importantly, the public? So should I participate, having shortly arrived, in a congressional hearing about medical devices? For me, I'm not an expert in medical devices. As I've said, it's a privilege to have been named editor-in-chief of JAMA, but I do not feel it's appropriate for me to be commenting on issues in which I have little or no expertise. Certainly not in public orally, where it's a much more difficult conversation to control. So what we were willing to do was to offer up a written report about what we thought about the literature around medical devices. But we declined to participate in the public hearing about medical devices. And they had no difficulty finding a number of people who could and would make comments. And I was very struck by an editorial in a Milwaukee paper who read the 3 reports, one from NEJM, one from JAMA, and one from an additional journal. And they commented that they thought that the report from JAMA was the one that was the most objective in trying to look at the information that Congress had asked us to comment on. So I think it is important to participate in these conversations, but in a measured way. We are informed by the Office for Human Research Protection of an ongoing investigation involving an article published in JAMA. We are then contacted by the media about our investigation. Should we initiate our own investigation? We did not. We didn't initiate our own investigation until the investigation from the Office of Human Research Protection was completed. This became a long and very difficult engagement between us and the media. It came to a conclusion with us issuing a notice of concern. It's a paper by Keogh. You can easily find it on our website, but it's an interesting story of very intensive negotiations and ongoing discussions and investigations by the Office of Human Research Protection about a paper that had been in JAMA, and then how we needed to respond after that investigation had concluded. We often do our own investigations when these issues come up, and I had given grand round somewhere else, and someone asked me or commented, and he was really quite nice about it, but he said, "You sound so arrogant when you say you do your own investigation." And I was surprised by the comment. The easiest thing for us to do whenever an issue comes up is to turn to the dean or a chair and say, "It's your problem, it's not our problem." And that's not our attitude. So when someone questions the veracity of what we publish, we believe we have a responsibility to the people who read JAMA, as well as a responsibility to the author to understand whether or not those allegations are true. There's a very prominent affair that occurred last year. Anil Hadi was a prominent investigator at Duke. Subsequently, about 20 of his papers have been withdrawn from Science, Nature, JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine. We had 2 papers by Dr. Hadi, and it was interesting. Duke requested that we withdraw both. One of the papers was based upon data in the Nature study. We withdrew that paper, but we told them we were not comfortable withdrawing the other paper. It was independent of the paper from Nature, and we were not certain whether or not there was anything that suggested that the data in the second paper was inaccurate. And we, in that case, requested that Duke provide us more information about why they thought that paper should be withdrawn. And after 9 months of investigation, Duke decided that the data in that paper was accurate. And to me, that was the appropriate way to respond to this issue. We're very careful around impugning the reputations of authors. We believe that it's our responsibility, even though it may take a number of months, to make or to take a very measured and reproducible approach to each of these concerns about data integrity or falsification of application. A study reports the relationship between attendance at a school-based health center and high school dropout and concludes, this study found an association between low to moderate school-based health center use and reductions in dropout for high school students. A letter to the editor suggests that this is a classical case of a mortal time bias. Now, my training was as a clinical scholar in New Haven with Alvin Feinstein, who is the grandfather of modern epidemiology. I don't think there was a single bias that can go unnamed in the current world of epidemiology. The authors treated a time-varying variable as fixed. The authors respond after conducting an appropriate analysis and find no relationship between attendance of school-based health centers and school dropout. Should the journal retract or correct the paper? So a fundamental finding in the paper is wrong. Should we retract it or correct it? In this case, we decided to correct it but not retract the paper. Corrections are linked, both digitally as well as in print. So if you search the paper, you will always find a correction. We did not think that it was a purposeful decision by the authors to mislead us or to do the incorrect analysis. Phil Fontana-Rosa, the executive editor, and I make all of the decisions that impact on tractions and corrections. We handle all of the investigations, just the 2 of us, with our attorney to ensure that, as I said, there's a reproducible approach to each of these complicated issues. What I've never been certain about is if this had been a drug trial where the outcome was fundamentally different, if the appropriate analysis would have been done. Whether or not under those circumstances, instead of offering a correction, we would have retracted the paper. And Phil and I discussed that at length, and we're uncertain. I think most editors don't like to talk about these issues publicly, but I'm very committed, to the extent that's possible, trying to be transparent about the decisions that we're making at JAMA. I think it's very, very important for investigators and other people who read JAMA to understand how we're trying to make decisions about what we publish and how we respond to complicated issues. A reviewer accepts our invitation to conduct peer review. In their response, they indicate that a colleague assisted them in the peer review process. We learned that the individual who assisted our peer reviewer has received support from the manufacturer of the device that is the focus of the paper. Should we discount all aspects of it? We do. Peer review is sacrosanct. It's confidential. BMJ has an open peer review process. Most of the U.S. journals maintain closed or controversial or confidential peer review. But conflicts of interest are alive and well in medicine. We're always concerned about them from an author standpoint, but we're also very, very concerned about them in the peer review process. What's been striking to me when I speak to my colleagues at Science, Nature, and Cell, where there's much more lab-based investigation published and is ongoing, conflicts in the lab-based sciences and in peer review are much more complicated than in our clinical review. It's important because when we get a very important clinical trial that involves 10,000 patients, that is the only clinical trial that's studying that particular question. You don't have competing clinical trials that are enrolling 10,000 patients. These clinical trials can cost between $50 and $100 million. But the competition in labs around discovery is much more robust than competition at the clinical level. So my colleagues at Science, Nature, and Cell are much more concerned about conflicts of interest around peer review. Senior faculty member at a U.S. medical school protests that an article in an archives journal misrepresents their outside interests. The individual then writes a letter to the editor and inadvertently declares no conflict of interest. My attorney comes down and sees me. He's been involved in all of this, and he says, Howard, how could that possibly have happened? He saw our forms. They're detailed. The whole discussion is around conflict of interest. How could he possibly return a form that says no conflict of interest when our attorney goes to a website and finds that he's on 6 boards of pharmaceutical houses? It takes 15 minutes, okay? I said, why don't you call him? Because this is what he'll say. He will say his secretary completed the form. He said, no way, it's not possible. Don't doctors read what they're signing? As I sit there signing contracts. I said, Joe, I am telling you. He will tell you it was an administrative oversight. He calls a physician who said, my secretary completed the form. If you're not certain, please declare your conflict of interest. You may not think it's a conflict of interest. I will tell you, our readers think it's a conflict of interest. I deal with more issues related to conflict of interest than any other single issue that is perplexing. Please be transparent. The web is a magical device for people to find information about you. If you traveled for society 3 years ago and they paid for that travel, and you are now publishing an article or commenting on an article related to that field, that may be a potential conflict of interest. Please just declare it. Read the forms carefully. Do not have someone else complete them on your behalf. The FDA approves a drug at high and low dose. Data about mid-range is lacking. FDA shares with the medical community in a leading medical journal why they did not approve the mid-range dose. Over the subsequent year, increasing concern is raised that the mid-range dose is necessary. We receive a commentary critiquing the FDA decision. It was wrong. They are not acting in the best interest of patients. The authors appropriately declare that both of them have been fee-for-service consultants to the company that makes the drug. So they've declared their conflict of interest. Should we publish the opinions? There are times when declaration of conflict of interest and what that conflict of interest is negates your ability to be involved. So we chose in this case not to publish the commentary. The FDA had already commented on the mid-dose range. there was an enormous amount of money at stake, and we felt it inappropriate in this case to publish this comment. We were informed by email that an article published 6 months ago contained fabricated or falsified data. We contact by email the individual who logged the complaint, but received no reply. Are we obligated to investigate the allegation? We can't possibly respond to every allegation unless there's some substantive data or evidence or information about the allegation. And since we could get no response, we chose not to investigate. I get a query every couple weeks about potential fabrication or falsification. I respond when I believe there's sufficient information that suggests we should move forward. Otherwise, we would spend virtually all of our time conducting various investigations. One of our archives editors is interviewed by a leading magazine. They reference the American Medical Association as the owners, publishers of the Archives Journal, inadvertently linking the AMA with the issue being discussed. As editor-in-chief of JAMA, should I intervene? Should I call the editors of the magazine and tell them that the AMA is the publisher, but the journals are editorially independent? Absolutely not. My goal is to ensure that JAMA is in the newspaper on a regular basis. I never want to be in the newspaper. If I'm in the newspaper, it will not be for the right reasons. So I carefully sculpt my encounters with the media. I would say they've treated us extraordinarily well over the last 18 months. We've had a remarkable run over the last 6 to 8 weeks about papers in, or the reporting of our articles in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. We've had a very controversial article about the risk of mild obesity on mortality. It's been roundly reported. It's been in the opinion pages of all of the leading newspapers. So I'd rather our authors and the JAMA articles be in the newspaper than me in the newspaper. A research report with 14 authors is received. Following peer review, we request a revision. The revision is submitted with 13 authors. The missing author contacts us and indicates that the corresponding author deleted his name without his permission. Who resolves this issue? This is the one time where, in general, we ask authors to resolve the issue. We try not to resolve authorship issues. But when there's change in authorship, it makes us concerned. So please be careful about order and number of authors at the time of submission. Well, in this case, we would have requested we make no decision about the final paper. We would then, when the final paper is submitted, we would then request email correspondence from each individual author, agreeing to the number of authors, the order of authorship, and from the contributing or corresponding author, we would ask for detailed explanation as to why there was any change. If it can't be resolved amicably, that's when we do call deans and department chairs. In general, journals try to stay out of authorship disputes. I'm going to pass. A leading U.S. health official and member of the JAMA family contacts me, expresses concern about a number of papers on a topic of enormous public health concern, suggests bias in reports. How should I respond? The leading health authority in the U.S., it's a major issue in American health. Involves hypertension, thinks something that we reported could do undue harm to millions. Because he's a member of the JAMA family, because the issue is so important, I reviewed the paper, the peer review, the comments to peer review, the re-review, and the final paper. I do not share them with him. Those are confidential documents. But I do speak with him on the telephone about the event, what occurred, and I tell him he is welcome to write a viewpoint or a letter to the editor. It's much faster to use email. My point here is one, I do feel like I have a responsibility to respond. Sometimes it's really much better to pick up the telephone. Oftentimes I'll see exchanges, long exchanges of emails, and I just would either tell my faculty before I came here or even now, rather than this reiteration between of email after email after email, I ask people to please pick up the telephone and just speak with someone. There's a way in which people can read into emails things that just aren't there. And so I would just offer guidance about, there's some really positive aspects about email, but sometimes I think they can promulgate debate, discussion when it's not necessary. I want to just stop with some observations, so I leave a few minutes for questions. I am lucky. People ask me all the time. I can't imagine a better job in medicine. It really is an extraordinary privilege to be editor of JAMA. I read the best of what individuals write, and I talk to extraordinary people. This year we'll receive 1,500 viewpoints. We will publish 150. Phil Fontana-Rosa, the executive editor, and I read every single one of them. So we'll read 750 each, and we share the ones that we're interested in. And I think because of that, I end up being exposed to the broad enterprise and landscape, which is U.S. healthcare, from clinical issues to health policy issues. The JAMA staff have been extraordinarily helpful. These changes are a product of a remarkably committed editorial and publishing group. 160 people work on these 10 journals. They're split between publishing and editorial. And the executive editor, Phil Fontana-Rosa, the executive managing editor, Matt Flanagan, are simply fantastic. I grapple with new, complex, and fascinating issues every day. We are committed to attracting the most influential content, developing new content, and using intelligent technological innovation to deliver that content. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for that review. It was fantastic. One of the criticisms of the Rupert Murdoch empire is the ability to control information to the masses through multiple media. And without the public understanding how each of the journals deals with this, with how they do things, the move from these separate names to a single empire with JAMA up front can raise that criticism. How do you address that to the public before that becomes an issue?
It's a fascinating question. The news reporter of ABC is an old friend, Rich Besser. So he emailed me yesterday. He goes, "I love the name change, but you may be confusing people, and what does it mean?" It's very, very similar. As a philosophy, we are committed to enlightened discourse. Okay. I receive a viewpoint a week critical of the FDA. But I think being director of the FDA must be the most difficult job in American medicine. It's extraordinary. There's not a single person who agrees with what the FDA does. We publish no paper that's critical without suggestions of what the FDA should do. We have a wonderful paper coming out by Jerry Avorn about the approval of a new drug using outcomes that are interim. And he's very critical about the decision to do this, and he has been in the past. But before we published it, I insisted that at the end of the piece, he give his recommendations about how the FDA should grapple with this issue. They do it all of the time. When there's not true medical outcomes and they have to use biological intermediaries to decide about whether or not to approve the drug. Jerry's voice in this issue is probably one of the most important in American medicine. And he actually was pleased when I said, "Jerry, I really want you to add that to the piece." So I think our goal across the network, particularly in our opinion pieces, is to ensure discourse. And we really do want it to be civil discourse. The other thing that we do, particularly JAMA, and it is because we recognize the influence. If you read the conclusions of our abstracts, we really are very, very guarded about ensuring that the authors don't extend their findings beyond what the results really suggest. So I think that's the other way in which we give information, we interpret information, but we try to do it in a way that allows our readers the ability to grapple with what we're talking about.
Questions?
See, the quality of the journal depends on the quality of the articles, which is also dependent upon the quality of the reviewers. In your school-based healthcare example, it appears your reviewers and/or your statistician was lacking. I was wondering how that impacts upon how you guys develop your pool of reviewers or your statisticians or both.
Yeah, you know, it's
Just repeat.
yeah. So the
version
question
of that
was about quality of peer review. The school-based health center is an example of a statistician missing it. You know, we're fortunate at JAMA because we have so many more resources. You know, I follow our letters to the editor carefully because in the letters to the editor, they'll often point out what they believe were errors in statistical analysis. You know, I remember when I was younger, you could ask any statistician a general question. Now there's statistician A for this type of study, statistician B for that kind of study. I mean, there's no general statisticians anymore. It's a struggle for us, I think, less at JAMA and more at the JAMA network journals. You know, I think one of the things that is helpful is that the majority of very, very important drug trials, which really are very influential in clinical care, the general feeling is of 50 or 100 important drug trials each year, they're only published in 3 journals. And I would say those 3 journals, Lancet, NEJM, and JAMA, have extraordinary statistical capacity to review papers. It's not the best answer, it's an honest answer. I know, having reviewed for many journals, that journals that don't have the resources simply can't muster the same critical review of papers.
Yes, sir.
As a clinician, how do you help us deal with the reality of publication bias?
Well, JAMA's very famous for publishing negative phase 3 studies. So because of the prestige of JAMA, we often get many negative phase 3 trials, not positive phase 3 trials. So when people talk about negative results being published in the leading medical journals, I think we're very committed because we know the importance of the question being asked. So at least around drug trials, if they're important, they're well done, and they're clinical trials, they will be published. There are other.
How do you become aware of it?
Say again.
How do you become aware of it?
Well, there's different abstracting mechanisms that will always make it easier. So I'm no longer affiliated with it. I have no conflict of interest. But I would say everyone should try to get an abstracting mechanism because you can't possibly read every article in your field that comes out. You know, the one that I've always liked more than any other is Journal Watch. It comes to you every morning at 7 or 8 in the morning. It links to the articles. You know, they're going over 100 different journal articles. It's from the Mass Medical Society. It's really, really well done. Journal Watch General Internal Medicine, the editor is Alan Brett from South Carolina. It's wonderful.
Questions? Yes, sir.
That was very entertaining. Thanks for coming.
You're welcome.
One of the things you didn't talk about is advertising in the journal. Obviously, the relationship between pharmaceutical companies and academia has had a lot of turmoil recent, and I wonder how you view all that in your position.
Thank you. On February 13th, Phil Fontana-Rose and I have what I would argue is my second most important editorial published. And it's entitled Restoring Confidence in the Pharmaceutical Industry. We spent 3 months writing it. And we have 4 precise recommendations for the pharmaceutical industry. I've spent the last year engaging in conversations with executives from 3 firms. I gave grand rounds of Pfizer. They couldn't believe I accepted. And I said, why wouldn't I accept? Pharmaceutical investigator scientists have contributed immeasurably to the health and well-being of people all over the world. That's become more confused over the last decade. They've paid $25 billion in fines. Most of those fines have not actually been for the scientific integrity of the studies. It's been for inappropriate marketing. And so I don't want to avoid answering the question, but I'm hoping people will read the editorial that Phil and I spent so much time working on. I hope pharmaceutical executives read it. And we need to restore confidence in the pharmaceutical industry. They fund 3/4 of clinical investigation in the United States, not the NIH. They spend between $50 and $75 billion on clinical studies. The NIH spends $15 billion. If we lose them as a source of funding for clinical trials, the health and well-being of the United States and citizens and around the world will decline. And so I want people to have restored confidence in the pharmaceutical industry. It's a slightly different answer than you probably expected around print advertising. I can only tell you that how we get advertising and where it runs, I have no idea. The business and the editorial are absolutely, there's a firewall between us and our advertising group that cures ads.
Final question? Yes, sir, at the back.
Can you discuss a little bit more about impact factor? I was shocked yesterday, not one of your journals, I got a review back, one of my papers that I submitted. And they had the reviewer's comments, but the editor of the journal also suggested numerous articles published in their journal that I cite and specifically said so that they could raise the impact factor of their own journal.
Well, I've been an editor before I came here. I've been an editor-in-chief of Archives of Disease and Childhood in England, and I've been on the editorial at BMJ, and so I do follow, I know a great deal about the impact factor. That issue is focused, that issue refers to self-citation, where you try to build your own impact factor by citing your own journal more in articles. The company Thomson Reuters that creates the impact factor does watch self-citation within the journal, but not within the network of journals. The impact factor is a measure of how often articles in a journal are cited over a 2-year period. Is the numerator, how many citations, say 10,000, divided by the number of substantive reports in that journal. Substantive reports is ill-defined. It always includes original research, but it always, for example, excludes editorials. If it's a review and it's 5 or 6 pages, it counts as substantive. If it's a perspective in NEJM or a viewpoint in JAMA, it doesn't count. Now, those can get cited, so it can build your numerator, it doesn't count in your denominator. As I told you, most journals have impact factors in the single digits. Some of the specialty journals, CID, JID, some of the respiratory journals will be in the 10 to 15 range. Cell Science and Nature are 30. JAMA's 31, Lancet's 38, NEJM is 54. I think that's only one measure of the quality of a journal. I actually think if the impact factor is done appropriately, it's actually a pretty good measure. Are we twice as good as BMJ that has an impact factor of 15 and we're 30? Absolutely not. BMJ is an outstanding publication. Is Lancet 22% better than we are? Absolutely not. But I think it does give you some measure of quality. It's less critical in the US than it used to be, because most promotions committees now look not just at, they don't just count the number of journals, they look at the value of your research portfolio over a time period. But yes, publication in journals with higher impact factors are important. Is that an answer to the question?
I was just wondering what you thought about the editor of the journal suggesting that I include citations from their journal for that reason.
It's inappropriate.
I was going to say you didn't have to answer that. Well, anyway, thank you so much. We look forward to the changes in JAMA. Appreciate it. Wonderful. Thank you so much. When are you leaving?
They should take
Right
video
now?
for I had an earlier flight.
I understand.
Otherwise, I was going to.
We'll take care of that. Do you mind if we take a picture? Do you have time for that? Let's see. Or is it?